Ethan's bloodshot eyes and tense face created an atmosphere so thick that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me. But that look alone was enough to make my entire world fall apart beneath my feet. "Do you think I don't know?" His voice finally broke the silence. Low but trembling with suppressed rage, his words made me feel like I was free-falling into a bottomless abyss. So I took a step back, clenching my palms. "Ethan, what are you talking about? You must quit lying." I attempted to speak in a steady voice, but every syllable was trembling. "Would you please stop? Do you think I didn't see the way you stared at him?" He took a step closer, his eyes blazing into me. "Do you really believe that I didn't sense it every time he touched you?" I froze his words, but he interrupted me before I could finish because I tried so hard to hide the truth that we both knew but were too scared to face. "Ethan." I choked out weakly, but he interrupted me before I could finish. "Didn't I?" I want to know why his voice cracked and his shoulders trembled. "Not your answer." "Why me? Why had it come to this?" I couldn't respond to him, not because I had nothing to say, but because saying anything would only make things worse. I stood there looking at him with regret and guilt, claiming that the sound of the rain quietly pattering outside my chest blended with the storm raging inside of me. I knew that there was no going back from what had happened between us, and that the truth was pulling us both into a vortex from which we couldn't escape. There was a deafening stillness in the living room as I sat silently and stared out the window where rain was clinging to the glass. However, memories played in my mind like a slow-motion movie, rewinding to the days I first met Ethan and Daniel, two guys who had completely changed my life. Daniel was the first to enter my life like a gentle breeze. He was the perfect man any woman could dream of, successfully composed and always attentive to others we met at an art seminar. And I was immediately drawn to his charm, and within months, we were in a committed relationship, and a year later we got married. However, marriage wasn't the fairy tale I had envisioned. Career consumed him. The once loving moments faded into silence, brief conversation, and nights he came home late. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that I needed to be patient. But over time the loneliness and emptiness grew stronger. Ethan, Daniel's son from his previous marriage, entered our lives during a sweltering summer. He had just finished his sophomore year of college and moved in with us to save money. I still remember our first meeting. A tall, broad-shouldered young man with a slightly awkward smile. Daniel introduced him with pride, and I made every effort to make a good impression at first. My relationship with Ethan was unremarkable. Daniel maintained a courteous but aloof manner as Daniel's work travels increased, but I regarded him like a younger brother. Ethan and I spent more time together, and we began talking more about trivial daily matters and deeply personal issues I had never shared with anyone, not even Daniel. I began to see Ethan as more than just a young man figuring out his life. He was deeper than I had imagined, hiding thoughts and feelings behind his calm exterior. On quiet afternoons on the porch, he would talk about his strained relationship with his mother, childhood, and the pain he had carried for years, his voice warm yet filled with hurt, revealed a young man who felt lost, belonging nowhere. Did his words strike a chord within me? They reflected my own struggles, a woman searching for connection and solace that I couldn't find in my marriage. I can't pinpoint when everything began to change. Perhaps it was the first time our eyes lingered on each other longer than they should have. The fleeting touch of his hand as he handed me a glass of water. I tried to convince myself that these feelings were a mistake, a byproduct of prolonged loneliness. But the more time passed, the more I realized I couldn't ignore the emotions surging within me. Ethan was no longer just my husband's son. He was the only person who made me feel truly seen and understood. One evening while Daniel was away on a business trip, Ethan and I were cleaning up after dinner. I was washing dishes, and he was wiping the table. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried so much weight when I turned and caught him looking at me. His eyes held all the emotions we had never spoken of. I had no idea why I stood still in front of his eyes, but I knew right then that everything had changed between us. Ethan stepped closer as if he couldn't resist the invisible force pulling us together, but then, as if held back by an invisible thread, he stopped, took a deep breath, and turned away. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. I nodded, but inside a storm raged. Those memories replayed in my mind over and over, a haunting reminder of how I had let things spiral out of control. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's gaze, about the way he made me feel like the only woman in the world. Yet I knew that if I didn't put an end to it, I would destroy everything: my marriage, my family, and myself. And then came that fateful night when all the emotions we had been suppressing exploded like an unstoppable storm. That night the house was quieter than ever. Daniel hadn't returned from his extended business trip, and I sat silently on the sofa with a glass of red wine in hand, my eyes unfocused as I stared at the flames dancing in the fireplace. The soft glow from the table lamp cast a warm but melancholic atmosphere. I made an effort to hide myself in a book, but my mind kept returning to Ethan. When did these emotions start? My hands shook as I put the glass down on the table, unable to calm myself, wondering when his eyes and speech began to have such a significant effect on me. Then I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Ethan was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and his hair was a little disheveled. His eyes caught in the dim light, and he stopped when he noticed that I was looking a little surprised that I was still awake. He asked in a deep voice that carried a hint of concern that I couldn't sleep. I tried to sound casual, but what about you? Is something wrong? He entered the room and remarked, I thought you might still be up because I heard the fire crackling. His simple words, I don't want you to sit here alone, caught me off guard. Perhaps this was what I needed. Someone to share the emotions I had been holding inside for so long. I gave him a small smile and gestured for him to sit down. Ethan took the chair across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. Are you okay? Sincerely, you've seemed different lately. I took a deep breath, not knowing how to respond because I've been thinking about a lot of things I said and finding it difficult to express the truth. Sometimes I feel like I don't really belong in this house. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting an understanding I didn't expect. I know that feeling, he said softly, his voice full of emotion. I felt that way so many times. I looked at him, surprised by his admission. Really, you always seem so strong and confident. I never imagined you felt that way. He gave me a little bittersweet smile. Everyone has moments of weakness they don't want others to see, don't they? Daniel is a good man, but there's something missing between us that used to be there but isn't anymore, he remarked, and his words resonated deeply inside me. I couldn't stop myself from speaking the things I had suppressed for so long because I feel like I don't genuinely belong here. Ethan looked at me, and his eyes locked with mine. I know that he said his voice was quieter now, but there are relationships where no matter how hard you try, there's a gap that can't be filled. The space between us grew heavy with tension and connection, and I felt as though Ethan could see right through me, understanding the things I hadn't dared to say aloud. Then, in an unexpected moment, the lights flickered and went out, leaving the house in darkness. I said, trying to break the silence, and Ethan got up to find a flashlight. When he returned, the dim beam illuminated his face, creating a scene that felt both familiar and unfamiliar in the shadows. He questioned in a kind but worried tone. I'm fine, I said as my voice wavered. I wasn't okay. I started but paused as if struggling with his thoughts. I don't want you to feel alone, Ethan said as he stepped closer, setting the flashlight on the table and casting a weak light over the two of us. My pulse was racing, and my breathing was becoming short. His eyes, the way he looked at me with such sincerity and longing, left me speechless. He leaned in the distance between us, shrinking with each second. I felt his breath warm and close. I knew I only needed to take a step back and say a word to stop this, that if I didn't think it would get out of control. However, I didn't. The world around us vanished, leaving only the two of us in that brief moment. But then the shrill ring of a phone echoed from the hallway, bringing us back to reality. I pulled away, guilt crashing over me like a tidal wave. I just stood there, allowing my emotions to overpower my reason. When his lips met mine, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was raw, full of all the emotions we had suppressed. Desire, pain, and the turmoil neither of us could deny. Ethan took a step back too, sorrow and agony shining in his eyes. I apologize, he said in a shaky voice. I shouldn't have interrupted him, Ethan. We can't do this. I said, this is a mistake, a terrible mistake. And he nodded, his eyes showing his pain. I know, he said, before turning and leaving me feeling as though my whole world had just fallen apart. The ringing of the phone from the hallway brought us both back to reality, and I took a step back, feeling as though I had just woken up from a dangerous but captivating dream. Ethan's eyes briefly locked with mine, carrying all the emotions we couldn't express, longing, anguish, and the turmoil that seemed to bind us together in an oppressive silence. I knew that everything had changed forever, and there was no going back to the way things were, but I also knew that if I didn't make a decision now, I would destroy everything. My marriage, my family, and myself. My heart clenched. I picked up my phone and tried to keep my voice steady as Daniel's name lit up the screen. I wasn't sure who looked away first, but when Ethan turned and left the room, closing the door behind him, it felt like the entire world had been sealed off. Outside, I sank into the chair, trying to steady my breathing with my trembling hands on the table. Daniel said, "It's me," in a warm and familiar voice. "I'm coming home earlier than expected." 2 hours seemed to go by like a tidal wave, and I knew that all would collapse if Daniel suspected anything was amiss. "I'll be there in about 2 hours. I needed to resolve this. I needed to cut off this risky, unclear relationship with Ethan right once, but how could I confront him after what had just transpired? Daniel came in smiling and carrying a bunch of flowers for me. "I missed you," he said, placing the flowers on the table and pulling me into an embrace. As he did so, a wave of guilt washed over me like a tidal wave. Daniel talked cheerfully about the highlights of his business trip, but I was unable to concentrate because my eyes kept going to Ethan's chair at the dining table, which was empty, and I felt as though I was waiting for something to happen that would change everything forever. Then, at around midnight, after Daniel had gone to bed, I heard a noise outside. My heart thumping, I stepped out into the dimly lit yard, where Ethan stood there, his face a mixture of deep pain and determination. "What are you doing here at this hour, Ethan?" I asked, my voice small and shaky. He said, "I can't just stay silent and pretend none of this happened," as he stepped closer. "There's nothing more to say," I interrupted, trying to keep my distance. "This will destroy everything." He shot back, his voice louder and brimming with emotion. "You think I don't understand that this could tear everything apart, but you also know just as I do that we can't deny what's happened between us." His words tore through the air like a thunderclap, and I stood there unable to refute him because I knew deep down that he was right and that we couldn't ignore the connection no matter how hard we tried. With tears in my eyes, I continued, "I can't hurt Daniel. I made a vow to protect this family, and I can't destroy it for something fleeting." Ethan gave me a distressed look and then told me he didn't feel anything. He continued, "Look me in the eyes and tell me this was all a mistake." His voice was calm but tinged with a faint challenge. I wanted to say it, to deny everything, but the words stuck in my throat. "Steady, you can't say it, can you?" Ethan took a step closer, and I could feel the warmth in his breath. He trembled as he murmured, and then we both turned in surprise as a noise came from the doorway. Daniel was standing there, his black eyes moving between the two of us, full of unasked questions, and the tension between the three of us was oppressive. "Daniel, what's going on?" Ethan inquired in a cool, collected voice that made me feel immobile. He dropped his eyes and slumped his shoulders. "It's nothing," Daniel said, his voice resigned. "I just wanted to say goodbye before I left." Daniel's eyes bore into me filled with doubt and suspicion. I knew that no matter how reasonable Ethan's explanation sounded, Daniel had sensed that something was deeply wrong, and at that moment I realized I couldn't run from this anymore. I had to face the truth, the choices I had made, and the consequences that were bound to follow. That tense moment in the yard lingered in my mind as I stood face to face. With Daniel in the living room, the space between us felt heavier than it ever had. His eyes filled with doubt, pain, and disappointment, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't want to see completed. Ethan had left shortly after leaving me with an indescribable sense of dread. I knew that from this moment forward, any attempt to lie would be pointless. The truth, no matter how much I wanted to hide it, always had a way of surfacing. Daniel sat down on the couch, crossing his arms, his piercing gaze demanding an explanation. I wasn't sure I could give Anna. He started with a low, deliberate voice that was laden with the words, "Wait, tell me what's going on with all of." I couldn't look him in the eye, so I looked around the room looking for an anchor, but everything seemed to be accusing me. Eventually, I sighed, realizing that there was no way out. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling, "I've made a mistake." He didn't answer, But the silence was worse than any words he could have said. I let my emotions cross a line. I can't deny that there has been a connection between me and Ethan, one that should never have happened. Daniel leaned back in his seat as if my words had drained him of all of his strength. I knew he said his voice was heavy with resignation, not relief because I felt something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe his admission broke me. My cheeks started to well up with tears. I apologized, my voice breaking. I had no idea how to stop it. He continued, his voice trembling. You've broken everything we built, and now I don't know if there's any way to fix it. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. His eyes full of sorrow. I knew I could never forgive myself for creating. But you did. I wanted to reach out to hold him to apologize in the most heartfelt way I could. But I knew my remorse wouldn't be enough. Daniel deserved better than the next day. Ethan left the house. There was no goodbye. No indication he'd ever been there. All that remained was a gaping void in my chest. A void I knew I would have to learn to live with. Daniel, though he stayed, became a distant figure. The warmth between us turned to cold detachment. Dinners were silent, conversations were half-hearted, every moment a consequence of the choices I had made. But the story didn't end there. A month later, Daniel surprised me by suggesting we go out to dinner. It was the first time since the incident that he'd initiated anything to break the tension. I thought maybe he was ready to forgive me, or at least trying to. But as we sat down at the table, he looked at me with a resolve I had never seen before. Anna, he said, his voice was calm, but steely. I want us to separate. I froze, the words hitting me like a blow. Daniel, you can't do this. I stammered. We can get through this. I know we can. He shook his head, his eyes unwavering. This isn't what I want, but it's what I need to do. I can't live every day knowing the person I love betrayed me, and the worst part is I'm not sure if you truly love me or if you're just holding on to something that's already gone. His words were the final knife cutting away any hope I had left. I knew he was right, though I loved Daniel. My betrayal had shattered the foundation of our relationship. There was nothing left to salvage. As I packed my things and left the home we once called ours, I felt like I had lost everything. But at the same time I understood this was the price I had to pay. Ethan was no longer in my life. Daniel was no longer in my life. All I had left was myself, and a painful lesson about what happens when you let emotions override reason. This ending wasn't clean. It wasn't about forgiveness or healing, but it was the truth. And it was the only thing I could accept.